These days, you can make music from anything. I'm going to show you how to take 100,000 numbers and turn them into something musical. This is the mysterious music of the yield curve. It's a chart that analysts use frequently to predict what might happen to the economy. And it's actually quite a simple chart. The y-axis just shows the interest rate, and the x-axis shows us for each bond what its maturity date is. So on the left-hand side, it can either be very short, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months. On the right-hand side, it can be very long dated, up to 30 years. And this yield curve here from 1992 is fairly typical of what you would expect from a regular yield curve, in that it's the longer dated bonds that generate higher returns. The thing is with the yield curve is that these rates change on a daily basis, and so the shape of the yield curve can change. So one of the things that can happen is it can flatten. And so this is the yield curve from 1989, and you can see that actually the yields are very, very uniform. It's a very, very flat yield curve. And this is a sign that people are starting to express uncertainty about what might happen to the economy. And in extreme cases, the yield curve can invert like this. So on the left-hand side now that you'll see, it's the shorter bonds that are generating the higher yields. And these inversions, many analysts consider them very, very important. Every recession in the US since World War II has been preceded by one of these inversions. But because the yield curve changes on a daily basis, tracking it over time can be difficult. And one of the things that we can do is we can use animation to show us what's happening on a daily basis. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the yield curve to animate from 1979, and you can see that 5 days animating per second here. So we get a sense of how the yield curve changes over time. If I speed that right up, you can see that actually the yield curve is very, very active, particularly at the shorter end of the yields. There's a lot of movement. With the yield curve animating so quickly, it can be difficult to remember how it's traveled over time. So one of the other things that we can do is introduce some ghosting of outlines from these peak inversions, so we can remind ourselves of where the yield curve has been at different points. So you can see here, October 1979 was an inversion 3 months before recession, and similarly in 1980. This generates an animation of about 3.5 minutes, and it's eerily silent. So could we actually use the data to produce sound as well as a visual? That's where this process of data sonification comes into play. And what we're going to do with sonification is we're going to take the y-axis, so that's from 0 to 15% on our yields of our bonds, and we're going to map that into a 4-octave scale of musical pitches. And if I take the yield curve back to its regular shape, and we introduce the sonification element, you get to hear what it might actually sound like. You can see that that's the rising pitch. As the yields rise, so does the pitch. And that's an upward ascending arpeggio that represents a fairly regular yield curve. And going back to the different shapes of the yield curve that we looked at earlier, we can start to hear what they sound like. So the flatter yield curve sounds pretty much as you would expect. It's the same notes repeated again and again because they're more or less identical yields. And then for our inversions, so those are the points where the short-term bonds are the highest, then that ripples downwards. And in the case of this inversion from 1980, you can notice that the overall pitch of the yield curve is higher because the yields are very high. They're up at 15% at this point in time. Now, the only problem now with our sonification is it's reflecting what we're seeing on screen very nicely, but at 2 seconds per day, this would generate an incredibly long animation and piece of music. And if we speed it up, then we get a little bit of a problem. Is that now animating 5 days per second, the music of the yield curve is quite difficult to pick up on. The arpeggio is too fast for us to discern. So instead, what we can do is actually speed the animation right up, but only play every 30 days the music. And that generates something a lot more melodious. And you can hear those changes in pitch, the level of the pitch and the direction of the pitch really following what we're seeing on the screen now in terms of the animation. And in many ways now the yield curve feels alive with both sound and audio being generated from the data. One issue now is that in audio space, we don't have the equivalent of our year markers or our date markers. We don't know what the passage of time is in the audio space. So the first thing that we can do is introduce a bass drum. And all the bass drum is going to do is it's synchronized to the month. So when you hear a bass drum, the gap between the bass drum is 1 calendar month. And you can see that's perfectly synchronized to the date on the screen. What we can also therefore do is introduce, so we're tracking the month, let's try and track the years. This time what we'll do is we're going to add on a year in vocal form.
82, 82, 82, 82, 83, 83, 83.
You can see that I've placed a slight delay, a repeating echo on the voice so that it fades out through the year, so you get a real sense of progression over time. And then to provide a final join between what we're seeing on screen and what we're hearing, we can also play a sound effect whenever those peak inversions appear on screen. So I'm going to take it right back now to 1979 with 4 layers of sound on.
1980, 1980, 1980, 1980.
You can see now that there's a perfect join between what we're seeing on screen and what we're hearing in the audio. So we really have sonified this yield curve. Now, why might that be a useful thing to do? Well, there is an argument that actually by hearing what you're seeing, it helps you to reinforce that experience generally. So it could make it much more memorable for you if you can hear the data as well as see it. But also for those people who can't see, this is a tremendously useful technique, because actually if you close your eyes, you're actually able to pass this yield curve data using audio alone. The data that I used on this project is freely available on the US Treasury website, and I've posted details of the tools that I used in the online article, along with links to a new tool that allows you to create sonifications without any coding. Feel free to post links in the comments to any visualizations that you've made yourself.
1990, 91.